I have with me a guest today that I have been wanting you to meet for quite a while because he is involved in helping Americans fight the false narrative that somehow law enforcement is the problem. And his organization does it in an incredibly real and participatory way. So I want you to learn about what they are doing. So you're the president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. Tell everybody what that is and what you do to help American law enforcement officers.
So the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We've been around for almost 30 years, believe it or not. And we're founded by, icons of the Reagan administration. Ed Meese, former Reagan Attorney General, was instrumental in getting us started, and a couple of folks that were working in the Reagan Justice Department and for just about the last 30 years have been law enforcement advocates. In the very beginning, really the idea was just to be able to try to raise some money to support law enforcement officers who had been wrongfully charged with crimes related to their work. And in most of those cases are use of force cases. And we have done that very successfully for the last 30 years. In fact, are now currently supporting 9 law enforcement officers across 8 cases. And the cases are all a little bit different, but most of those cases are criminal cases against police officers and their typically use of force cases, and most of our cases are. And the other part of our work, as you alluded to, is we're also general advocates for law enforcement, for effective professional law enforcement. And so some of our work is in the policy and research arena. We've produced policy papers. We've done original research on topics like police attrition, the impact of Soros-funded progressive prosecutors, and the impact of the Department of Justice consent decrees on law enforcement and many other topics. And, sort of we engage with the media, produce original research and the like to support law enforcement.
So that's one of the things I wanted to talk about is, we hear a lot from the current administration about federal consent decrees. And when I talk to citizens, they say, well, okay, if we have to have some federal oversight, I guess that's okay. But can you help explain to people what those consent decrees are and sometimes the negative impact that they have?
Yeah, sure. Consent decrees are statutorily authorized by Congress. They allow the department, empower the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to conduct what are called pattern or practice investigations of law enforcement agencies. And this is distinct from criminal investigations that the Civil Rights Division might do into individual cases involving police. These are far-reaching, exhaustive, expansive civil investigations of law enforcement agencies where they're quote unquote looking for what they call a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. They sound innocent enough. I mean, I think to the general public, it sounds like, well, that's a good thing. We of course we want our law enforcement agencies to conduct themselves in a constitutional way. And I think, we can all agree with that general principle that yes, law enforcement should conduct themselves in a constitutional way. That all sounds great. The problem is that the Department of Justice has what seems to be a virtually unlimited budget for doing this. And once they come into a law enforcement agency, they look at every single thing, and it starts to grind the work of the agency to a halt. And I'm not speaking about this in some theoretical sense. In reality, if we look at the cities where there are currently consent decrees, including New Orleans and Baltimore, as 2 examples of agencies I'm very familiar with, but then they propose additional consent decrees in new cities like Minneapolis and Phoenix and others. The resulting consent decrees are so broad, so expansive, so in-depth that they tend to make law enforcement officers turn away from law enforcement because it might turn conducting a traffic stop into a 45-minute paperwork exercise for the Department of Justice monitors and Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to review. And you don't have to believe what I'm saying. Just look at the objective data on cities involving consent decrees, how long they stay in, how expensive they are, and what the impact is. And you can look at the impact in a couple of different ways. One is crime. What's the impact on crime? Look at what the crime rate was before the consent decree and look at what it is afterwards. Look at morale, look at police attrition. There's so many different measures you can look at. and the impact has not been positive.
You're absolutely right. Very often, a consent decree is a death knell for that agency, because very often police officers leave, and really the only positive impact they have is the consultants involved in them tend to get very wealthy, and they're the ones who control whether their contract continues or not, and they don't make the public any safer. And I think that is the biggest takeaway from these situations. Again, law enforcement, of course, we need oversight. And I think American law enforcement does a pretty good job of policing ourselves. But when the federal government steps into local law enforcement, it can be very problematic, can't it?
Well, it can. And I mean, I'm just telling you, as someone who actually sat at the table and negotiated one of these consent decrees in Baltimore, that the attorneys from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, they're nice people. I got along with them fine. It's just their philosophy on the types of the approaches that law enforcement should take to effectively combat crime and promote public safety were, in my view, completely wrongheaded and destructive. In fact, they were antithetical to any form of what we would call proactive policing. In other words, going out and looking for people who are committing crimes and stopping them. They wanted to include all kinds of provisions in the consent decree that would disincentivize that would actually make police officers not want to do that, and in some cases even prohibit or severely restrict the ability of officers to make arrests for certain things like gambling, trespassing, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest as a criminal charge. And so it's clear that the agenda is to move policing away from policing, and the results have not been good. Even if you don't even have to look at the policing perspective of it. You can look at the police accountability activists in response to, in cities where there have been consent decrees, they're never satisfied with the outcomes from the consent decree. So they're not even seeing the types of improvements that they wanted to see in policing. At the same time, crime increases universally. Expenses are through the roof for the city. So I guess the moral of the story here is, what, if any, positive impact is there in cities where there have been consent decrees in the past? And is there a better way? I mean, if we can agree that there are instances in which there are police departments that are troubled, I think that's true. I think there are cases where institutionally there are police departments that need help. And is there a better way for us to get help to more quickly turn those agencies around, to improve morale, to improve their ability to fight crime, and very importantly, to improve the credibility that they have to the community that they serve, which is important. And I don't think consent decrees are in any way the best vehicle for that. I think they've proven themselves to be very ineffective. And I think there is a better way. And that's really the conversation we're trying to instigate is, okay, we can all agree on certain basic facts, but I think we have to really look at what we're doing now. Is it working? It's not working. It's counterproductive. Is there a better way? And I think the answer to that is yes.
Another thing that we're hearing from the anti-police activists is take away qualified immunity, and that will make cops, quote unquote, behave. Talk about qualified immunity, because I don't think most people really understand what that is.
So qualified immunity is just it's got a complicated history, and there are those who argue that it was created out of whole cloth by the Supreme Court in a series of Supreme Court cases. You hear about it most often now when there are very strong activist voices, anti-police, anti-law enforcement activist voices that want to do away entirely with qualified immunity as it applies to police officers. Not necessarily as it applies to other government workers, which is a hypocrisy in itself, I think. But they're targeting law enforcement officers, which, by the way, law enforcement officers are by far the most likely people to have to deal with the lawsuits that potentially offer some protection to them, for which qualified immunity officers some protection. So qualified immunity, the idea is that it gives protection to any government worker, not just law enforcement, but including law enforcement, in a situation in which they're attempting to do their job essentially in good faith. They're doing it in a way that is not inconsistent with the law as they know it to be. So it's not exactly a good faith standard, but I mean, that's the best way to understand it, is that if a law enforcement officer is basically operating within the scope of the law as they understand it to be, then they're protected. Again, for civil cases, it doesn't have anything to do with protecting you from being charged with a crime for anything you've done, but for civil cases. The interesting thing is that a very low percentage of cases that are brought against police officers are actually dismissed based on qualified immunity, which to me has always raised the question of why the activists are going after qualified immunity so strongly, because it's not doing that much to protect law enforcement. They act like it's this magical shield for accountability, when in fact it really is not. And even some of the researchers that are on the other side of this issue will acknowledge that it actually doesn't protect. You look at the data, doesn't actually protect law enforcement officers the way it's probably intended to do. But it does in cases in which the officer, again, has acted in good faith, tried to do the right thing, and tried to apply the law the way they understand it to be. Constitutional law is complicated. There are always new cases coming out. And as long as it doesn't clearly violate the law, then the officer would receive protection from it. But it really doesn't come up that much. And it is the target of attacks. And the only thing that I can attribute that to is that it's an opportunity to mislead the public about the accountability systems that exist for police officers. If you sell the public on the idea that there's this immunity that law enforcement officers have that other people do not have, it is misleading. It's actually not accurate at all. And they never, ever get into the weeds of what qualified immunity really means. They just make it sound like, well, cops are immune from lawsuits and they can't be charged with a crime and this and that. We know all of that is not true, that police officers are regularly sued, that rarely are those cases dismissed on qualified immunity.
I'm one of them. I've been sued multiple
most police
times.
Officers, I shouldn't say most, many police officers will be sued in the course of their careers. And it's here are the important things to understand. When cops do something wrong, especially if it's malicious, we want them to be held accountable by some system, whether it's the civil system, the criminal system, or the administrative system. Even police, by and large, agree with that like any other profession, you're supposed to do your job correctly. However, because of the nature of the profession, you're going to come into conflict with people. People are going to see the government as deep pockets, and you're going to be a target to be sued. Anytime you have a negative interaction or even a not so negative interaction, there's always the potential that you could be sued. We understand that when we enter the profession that could happen. We also understand or the expectation is that we'll be treated fairly by the system. We'll receive due process. We won't be treated less than just because we're law enforcement officers, and that we'll receive some protection from our employers. At a minimum, that they will provide legal counsel to us for any time we're sued in connection with the scope of our employment, that our employer will provide legal counsel. And if there should be a settlement or a judgment, that in most cases, the employer will pay that on behalf of the police officer. Police officers, don't have the kind of financial resources to pay for settlements and judgments. Now, there may be an extreme case where the officer's conduct was so egregious that they should participate in that personally. I agree with that. I don't have a problem with that, but that's not the regular case. That has to be the far outlier case. And, we unfortunately have seen a few of those in the past, but by and large, officers need to have the protections from the system to be treated fairly like everyone else.
Well, and if those protections are taken away, we're already having a hard time retaining and recruiting police officers. I think that would be catastrophic to the profession. One of the other issues that is in the forefront now, we've had 3 years of this social experiment of depolicing, de-incarceration, and of course, deprosecution. And I think the most devastating of that is this deprosecution that is sweeping the country, especially in the urban areas of the United States. Talk about, because you guys are involved in this very much, these George Soros installed prosecutors around the country, starting with Kim Fox in Cook County, Illinois, and how devastating they are to this country, to our communities, and to crime victims.
Yeah, it's what I normally say is, there are two fundamental flaws right now in our criminal justice system. One, of course, is the depolicing, which has been brought on by so much anti-police sentiment that it's made it very difficult for police officers to do their jobs in virtually every jurisdiction. Can't recruit enough officers, can't retain enough officers. We're in a very difficult place with respect to policing, but that's not the whole story. As you indicate, the other real big part of the story is prosecution. What happens when police do bring cases of people who are career criminals, who are violent, repeat violent offenders, and they're bringing those cases. In many cities, they're just essentially being dismissed right away. And violent crime cases as well as non-violent property crime, things like theft. I mean, look, how often do we see videos of people going into grocery stores now and just filling bags full of stuff and walking out with absolute impunity? And it's really not because those cities have made theft legal. It's because the prosecutors in those cities refuse to prosecute theft up to a certain amount. And those amounts have gone higher and higher and higher. And we sort of trace this back to the approximately 70 prosecutors in the United States that are what we call Soros-affiliated prosecutors. So they're either directly funded by George Soros or one of his many interests, or they're part of the club. So, for example, there are some states where the campaign financing laws are fairly restrictive. I happen to live in one of those states in Maryland, where only $6,000 from an entity or an individual can go to a particular political campaign. So it's not a great state for Soros. Many states don't limit that at all, so they can just funnel lots of money into any political campaign. But so there are other prosecutors in those states and in other situations where they get invited to the powwows that Soros and his groups have, and they follow the guidelines, the decarceration, progressive prosecutor guidelines. But there are about 70 of them out there. And the destruction, there's no way to overstate the destruction, the destructive force that they've had. And the unfortunate problem is that we're sort of in an echo chamber talking about this problem. The only people that seem to be paying attention are people who are involved in the system, in law enforcement, or otherwise are paying close attention to what's happened. You can't break through this narrative, this story about the Soros prosecutors. You won't see on the network. You won't see it on CNN or MSNBC or any of the other mainstream media outlets. So many people don't know about it. Even people who may be further left politically, but still want to see public safety, they don't even know this problem exists. And when they go in to vote, they're voting for candidates that in many cases are straight up decarceration, anti-public safety, anti-police candidates, and they don't even know it. Because the prosecutor races are kind of down ballot. There's not often as much publicity. It's much easier to win an election with less money, and that's why the Soros interests have targeted prosecutors. They have incredible discretionary authority. They can doesn't matter how many laws the legislature passes, they can either enforce them or not, and they can do that unilaterally, apparently. And it
also doesn't matter whether the police put together a really fantastic case, right? And that's one of the things that we always are trying to emphasize to people is that the police can arrest every bad guy out there, everyone who is accused of committing a crime. But if we don't have a prosecutor who will work with us, the whole thing is pointless. And that also adds to the poor morale of law enforcement, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, how many times are you going to hit your head against the wall, bringing somebody in with a rock solid case of whatever, and then have the prosecutor's office say, no, we don't prosecute these cases anymore. And that's happening. I mean, that's real world stuff. And your viewers and listeners who are in law enforcement or recently retired or close to law enforcement are hearing those stories. There's no question about it. And that, if you really had to rate it, I mean, I think that is like the number one challenge that we're facing as a community of people interested in protecting public safety is this prosecutor issue. And it just doesn't, no matter what we do to try to bring more attention to it, it doesn't seem to be breaking through in the mainstream. Again, people who work in the system are aware of this, they understand it, and they're speaking out against it, but it's just, it will only go so far, unfortunately.
Jason, what is the end game, do you believe, for these activists and elected officials that want to destroy American law enforcement as it is and really destroy our criminal justice system?
I get that question a lot, and unfortunately, I have yet to come up with a great answer. I try very hard to avoid becoming a member of the Tinfoil Hat Society and come up with, these very elaborate conspiracy theories. I'm not a conspiratorial guy by nature.
I'm asking you because I need an answer myself.
Well, I say all that prelude to say, really, I mean, I didn't think there was any coordinated. When I first started looking at this issue, I was like, well, this is just one guy's view of the world or whatever. But it's hard not to look at this and to not conjure an image of a coordinated process to try to, I don't know, lead toward Marxism or something. I don't know, but it is troubling. It is obvious what the impact is. It's not good. It's very bad. It has been very bad. It seems like it's going to be very bad in the future. You've got the biggest, probably the biggest bully pulpit in our country is the presidency, right? So if we had a president who was speaking out in a way, pointing out how problematic this was, there would be some, I would be encouraged. But we don't have that. We've got the opposite. We got our president, unfortunately, current president, is speaking in a very supportive ways about these policies and giving them credibility. And they seem to be gaining more momentum than anything. And so the end game, I don't really know, but I don't think it's an end game that any of us are prepared to accept. And I think we really need to use our voices to bring greater attention to this problem. It's a serious problem. There is a risk of it upending our democracy as we know it.
Yeah, that is very well said. Where can people find out more about you and your organization?
Yeah, so our website is policedefense.org. Policedefense.org. We got lots of information. Our research projects, the cases that we support. We're also on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all the normal spots that you can find us. Police Defense is our standard handle on those platforms.
I tell you what, thank you for all that you do for American law enforcement, and thanks for spending time with us today. And if you'd like more information about us, visit us at nationalpolice.org.
Ma'am, put the gun down! Put the gun down!
Last year, law enforcement officers were involved in hundreds of thousands of use of force incidents. A use of force incident is when an officer must use nonverbal tactics to gain control of a dangerous situation.
Put the knife on the ground.
In many cases, officers have no choice but to use force when a suspect doesn't comply with a lawful order.
Use of force is always ugly. No one likes it, especially police officers.
Together, we can help de-escalate these dangerous encounters. Help police officers by complying with their lawful orders. Don't attack, attempt to disarm, or flee from an officer.
Use of force is an officer's last option. Most incidents can be avoided by not resisting arrest.
If you feel you've been wrongfully detained by a police officer, then seek a legal solution after the encounter has been resolved.
Let's keep everyone safe. Comply now and complain later.